Hello everyone, this is Maz. If you're hearing this message, it means you're not part of the Voices of War subscriber community and will only hear the first half of the episode. If that's enough, then I'm thrilled. However, if you're looking to dive deeper into the complexities of war, please consider subscribing to our private feed by using the link at the top of the show notes. By doing so, you'll gain access to all of our episodes, the ability to ask follow-up questions, and will become part of an exclusive community that makes this show possible. I hope you'll make the decision to join us today.
A war of choice is something upon which one's national destiny does not hang, okay? Russia did not face extinction of its way of life and its values, or as an entity in and of itself, because of the existence of Ukraine. It just didn't. In order to make up for that kind of forced deficit, then they have to remove restraint in order to be able to sort of increase their fighting capacity. And that's never a good idea, because as soon as you remove restraint, all you do is you harden the other side. Was it fair to ask them, with their limited resources, to do as much as they did? And I would say no. Now, does this explain why certain Special Forces soldiers ended up sloughing some of the restraints to which they were ordinarily expected to operate unto? Yes, it does. The idea that people are resources that can be used over and over and over and over and over again without consequential effect on them is nonsense.
My guest today is Dr. Jonathan French Flint, who is an Inamori Research Associate, military ethicist, and strategic theorist at Case Western Reserve University. Jonathan has previously taught in the UK and has presented at conferences on both sides of the Atlantic, as well as the United States Army Command and General Staff College. He has published on military ethics with the International Committee of the Red Cross and has also appeared on the Canadian CTV Network as a subject matter expert on the war in Ukraine and on military and international affairs more broadly. Jonathan joins me today to discuss strategic theory and how it can help us wrestle with and maybe simplify some of the complexities surrounding whether and how we go to war. Jonathan's particular focus within strategic theory is on the role of potential strategic benefits of ethics when developing a strategy for war. Jonathan, thank you very much for joining me on the Voices of War.
Oh, delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
And just to clarify before we go, it is Johnny, right? You prefer Johnny?
It is. Yes.
So
mothers and police officers call me Jonathan.
Good, great. So just that the audience doesn't think I've all of a sudden become rude, but that's why I'm referring to you from here on in as Johnny. So firstly, Johnny, I recently read your PhD thesis, and I know you've done a lot of work since then and even before it, but it was the original prompt for the discussion, as much as I know that the discussion will go into a number of different aspects. But before we dive into the perilous waters of military ethics and your work, let's maybe first get a sense of your own background. How did you end up in military ethics? What motivated that journey in the first place?
Well, embarrassingly, I sort of wandered into it. It's a sort of a bit like a local pub. So what happened was I went back to college in my late 20s, and I went to the Open University, which is, anyone can go there. It's a fabulous institution. Then after I finished my BA, it was like, what do I do next? Well, let's do a master's. And I ended up going to the University of Hull, where I did their master's degree in strategy and international security. And towards the end of that, I was the dude who was running my program sort of tried to recruit me for a PhD, and I was sort of interested in I'd had some questions which weren't answered during my master's, and I thought might be fun to look at these. And I ended up going to the first conference of the European International Society for Military Ethics. Just to kick the tires a bit and everything else. And everybody was really nice. And someone who I'd met previously there, the now sadly late Colonel David Benest, who was a CO of, I think, 2-para, attended. And we all got along brilliantly, and everyone was terribly welcoming. And all of a sudden, and I'm sat in these sessions and I'm listening to these voices talking about military ethics, and I'm thinking, hang on a minute, there's a window here, because I'm now a newly minted strategic thinker, right? I've got my certificate and everything. And I'm thinking, there's a window here, because none of this is actually at odds with one another. I don't think. I think I can square this circle a little bit if I wanted to. And so I thought, well, okay, let's see what happens. And I spent the first year of my PhD effectively inhaling people like Michael Walzer, and all the sort of the regular canon, going back to Aquinas and sort of checking out, his rules, and sort of bumping into some other sort of people who probably should have discovered beer was invented. And and all of a sudden it's like, well, this is very interesting, isn't it? And so I kind of stuck with it. And my contention was that you find in the canon of strategic theory literature, you find that ethics gets a fairly short shrift. Even my supervisor once sort of said that, of course we have to pay lip service to ethics, but it was sort of it wasn't, how can I put it, authentic. And my contention is that actually paying authentic attention to making positive ethical decisions, although it may mean managing how we go about things differently, is actually more likely going to succeed than not. And I don't think that the two sides speak different languages necessarily. I think it's just they both speak the same grammar. I just think that their vocabulary is different.
Well, given what we're, certainly in the Australian case, what we're learning at the moment and how much of a role ethics is playing in our daily coverage of alleged war crimes in Afghanistan, I think you're onto something. But before we get to, I guess, the overall concept, topic, thesis, what is strategic theory? Because many of my listeners might not be familiar with the actual ins and outs of what it actually includes.
Well, strategic theory is sort of absorbed as sort of a subset of politics, or security studies or anything else. A lot of your listeners, will be aware of Clausewitz. Right?
I assure you, if there's one in here, they'll be in trouble. Well, at least it's drummed into all of us, at least military people.
Exactly. So what did he do? Well, he basically sat down and wrote a philosophy of war, if you read the first books. Right? If you ignore the muddy bit in the middle and you look at the beginning and the end, what he's writing is he's writing a philosophy of war. And he's writing his philosophical approach to war. Now, that's not the only way about it, because, of course, there's Antoine-Henri de Jomini, of course, and he wrote, his approach, which was Napoleon's approach, and involved lots of lines on maps and sort of lots of prescriptive reasons. Both of these guys are trying to get to the same thing, and that thing is coming up with a method of thinking about the conduct of warfare and how it can inform those that conduct it and those who are interested in its conduct. So strategic theory is effectively, and go through Little Hart, Gray, Bernard Brodie, Herman Kahn, Kissinger, sort of, but even going back as far as there's this wonderful book called The Strategemata of Frontinus. And all of these books are about creating ways of thinking about how to conduct operations, their wider effects and all of that. So strategic theory is like political theory, the theory of strategy, trying to explain how war works, how strategy works, and what its best practice is and isn't. And that's what strategic theory is. It's simply trying to get to grips with the intellectual part of war which a lot of people don't think exists. And actually, war is a very intellectual exercise.
Well, it's an all-consuming exercise, right? But what I'm just perplexed about is the fact that what you're saying, that ethics never seem to play a big role in strategic theory, or doesn't feature as a pillar of strategic theory.
Certainly more in the modern time, it seems to have gone away from that sort of. Now, I'm not going to blame Sir Lawrence Freedman for this, but that sort of Sir Lawrence sort of established the Department of War Studies and created war studies as a genre, as an aspect of the academy. And Sir Lawrence is not without ethics. I mean, I love him deeply. But some of his contemporary writers, and even going back to other people who have dabbled in strategic theory, like Adolf Hitler and others, have sort of made victory at all cost part of the thinking. And we see that today in current political discourse. The former president of the United States, Donald Trump, once stated that the laws of war were for losers and people only lent on the laws of war if they were losing. And so one must assume then that from his conception, therefore, that fighting without the laws of war, without sort of this commonly agreed boundary of what's acceptable and not acceptable in war, that is sort of, in his view, as commander-in-chief, a sort of the zenith of practice. And the thing is that, we see words like lip service paid to ethics in canon, or we see, for example, Colin Gray sort of virtually, at times seemingly dismiss the idea of being good because we are held to the strategic theorist, the strategist, the soldier is held to the moral imperative of victory. And part of me questions whether that's an entirely sustainable position to take. And so what I try to do, and what I try to do in sort of some of the stuff I do is to say that is actually unsustainable. And that there is a more sustainable way of doing it, but you might not like what it costs.
Yeah, right, okay. And we'll definitely get to that. But
absolutely.
To what extent do you think this also has something to do with our definition of victory, or the lack thereof?
Well, victory is one of those slippery terms, isn't it? What are the conditions of victory? I mean, let's look at Afghanistan. Let's just pull that from the sky right now and say, okay, so the conditions of victory in Afghanistan were actually relatively straightforward. Originally, which was the removal of the Taliban government from power in Afghanistan. Okay, great, happy days.
Well, initially it was even earlier than that was the removal of Al Qaeda.
Yes, exactly.
Which was the original reason, right?
One followed from the other.
That's right. Yeah, so that's already the first morphing of. The reason,
but then the thing is, it starts getting a bit slippery after that, because then what's the condition of victory? Okay, so we're there, we've won. Now, what is it? I don't like the term victory anymore. Because it's slippery and it's difficult to define in certain conflicts. I like the idea of conditions of success. What do we need to do to say that this has been a successful operation? What does a successful withdrawal from Afghanistan look like? What does a successful withdrawal from Iraq look like? A managed withdrawal from Iraq. What are we leaving behind? And this goes back to the lessons that we learnt in 1917 and the lessons that we further learnt in 1945. So the lessons that we learnt in 1917, well, we beat the Germans. Hooray, great, happy days. We then exacted horrendous punishment on the Germans, flattened their economy, stripped them of any kind of source of national pride and hobbled their industry. And all we did was create the conditions for the Second World War. The First World War was a victory, right? Second World War, it was a victory However, what we sort of paid attention to was also the conditions of success. What were the conditions of success of the Second World War? First, beat Germany. Second, make sure it can't happen again. And how do we do that? Well, the Marshall Plan and things like that. And then we and our condition of success was having a safe, certainly in West Germany's case, democratic West Germany bound by laws with enough constitutional safeguards to be a good neighbor to the rest of Europe.
And a demilitarized populace, I guess, in many ways. Yeah.
Demilitarized-ish. Yeah. But that's the thing, because Germany was thoroughly demilitarized after the First World War. But the Second World War, Germany, in stages, was allowed to reform the Bundeswehr. It was allowed to reform its air force. It was allowed to create a navy, and now these had constitutional safeguards around them, which the Germans were perfectly happy with, by the way. But the thing is that what we did was we left Germany capable of becoming, for example, ultimately a NATO member and a good neighbor. Now, that's not to say that we didn't spend a lot of time in Germany sort of backing them up and keeping an eye on them. But the important thing was that we set a condition of success that Germany should be safe, prosperous, and well run. And that's what we got.
No, and that's certainly not what we got in Afghanistan or Iraq. Again, I guess that's perhaps the point that you're trying to make, that our definition of victory, certainly for these two conflicts, hasn't been clearly articulated, and therefore we didn't have the resources, to institute that, whatever that, those conditions for success might have been.
Well, I think what's interesting about those two conflicts, which stands very much apart from the world wars, is that both Afghanistan and Iraq are definitely wars of choice, not wars of necessity. And wars of choice bring with them a far harder, a much greater challenge of defining what victory actually looks like, because the reasons for doing it are also quite complex and very difficult, and difficult to articulate at times. And so the more complicated the cause of the war, the more complicated the conditions of success they are to define. And I think that's broadly where we go.
Yeah. I actually had a question on that for you about, this difference between war of necessity and war of choice, because there are different ethical imperatives in both. And in my mind, I'm still struggling to understand sufficiently well how a war of choice, by the sheer fact that it's not the last resort, because we have a choice. In other words, it's not a matter of, as much as people will say, well, even in a defensive war, you have a choice. You can, roll over and die or fight. But, that choice is much easier to make, right? As in the sense that you will defend because every animal will. That's what an animal will do, and the human animal as well. Whereas a war of choice is where we're making a conscious, cognitive, non-emotive, presumably rational decision to interfere in some conflict or start a conflict for reasons other than mere necessity. And I still haven't been able to reconcile how if war of choice can ever be ethical.
Well, what I would definitely challenge you saying that it's an unemotional decision, or even in some cases a rational decision.
Well, I would have put that in air quotes if I could, because seemingly so, right? That's at least in narratives, and take Afghanistan, take Iraq, for example, especially Iraq, I would say.
Yeah, you have to. Right. I mean, okay. So let's go for war of necessity. Now that's relatively straightforward, isn't it? I'm being attacked. I must defend.
That's Ukraine right now.
That's Ukraine right now.
In a nutshell.
Now, right. Okay. Fine, easy, happy, very easy to understand. War of choice. Well, the problem with the war of choice is that it's really broad, right? So I can justly start a war of choice if I so choose. Okay. I can be motivated by sympathy for a country that is defending itself and declare war on the country that's attacking it. And I can I can rationally say, because I don't have any skin in the game on this one. Let's say, let's take Burma and Thailand. Myanmar and Thailand start knocking seven bells out of one another. Okay, and that Burmese troops are committing war crimes against Thai civilians. Now, I, as America, the superpower, don't have a lot of skin in this game. Regionally, it's not particularly interesting. It's in China's backyard. I don't want to tweak them. I get nice restaurants and shrimp imported from Thailand, but that's about the extent of my interest. However, I can emotionally and rationally say that I can justly enter this conflict against Myanmar in defense of the Thais, because it's perfectly reasonable for me to go to war in defense of someone else. Or in defense, so I can do that.
It feels like that's almost a third category, and I've read this somewhere. But someone else talk about this, but it isn't.
But it isn't. It all falls into this one big ugly category. So
the feels like the moralness. It could not be described as moral necessity, though. That's what the basis of R2P is, right?
Well, yes, and that's the problem with R2P, isn't it? Because if you declare we are going to be guided by responsibility to protect, we're never going to be not fighting. Because a true commitment to responsibility to protect means that you are now involved in every conflict in the world, and you have to try and pick which side you want, even when both sides are utterly disgusting. Because you have a responsibility to protect. So the problem with R2P is that there is whilst R2P is great, and I love the responsibility to protect, the problem with it is that I don't think anyone has enough capability to be truly led by R2P. You have to pick your fights. Unfortunately,
because it's so hugely subjective.
Exactly. And the thing is, other people may think that other things, other sides have a responsibility to protect other sides. Now, R2P, for example, created Kosovo, and I think, and I love it, and that Kosovo has lived in relative peace and security, although it has horrendous problems, is better than what happened prior to the establishment of Kosovo. However, that wasn't without risks. The race for Pristina Airport, for example, where we very nearly ended up with Western troops facing off against Russian troops, and that could have been very, very messy. So there is, unfortunately, there always has to be that tang of interest involved in there. And we may indeed get, to go back to my Thailand example, it may be that America values its farmed shrimp consumption so much that it may say that, well, I also have an interest in the region. I like cheap shrimp. And so, it may say that is the rational reason upon which I'm going to hang this, or one of the reasons I'm going to hang this, to try and make the case for going to war. Now, going back to your Ukrainian thing, this is a war of choice on behalf of Russia. Now, it's been sold to the Russian people by the president as a war of necessity, but it is a war of choice. And the reason why I say it's a war of choice is because a war of choice is something upon which one's national destiny does not hang. Okay? Russia did not face extinction of its way of life and its values, or as an entity in and of itself, because of the existence of Ukraine. It just didn't. And so Russia has chosen to fight that war. And so that is a war of choice. The invasion of Germany, the invasion by Germany of France, or the Sudetenland, or the Benelux, that was a choice, the aggressor's choice there. They made those choices, okay? And, ignoring any claims of preemptory self-defense or anything else like that, it's absolute nonsense. The thing is that, there is always, I would suggest there's always an element of choice in whichever side decides to move first, because but the other side is, may not be facing extinction, at which point it becomes, another war of choice. The other side may be reinforced by people who have decided to enter a war of choice. But the war of necessity in and of itself is simply the act of defense. It gets kind of interesting when you start looking at it in those terms.
It gets interesting, and I think it gets also fuzzy because in my mind there's a difference between intervening, in your example of Thailand. There's a moral imperative because they say there's genocide, there's ethnic cleansing, or whatever it might be. That to me is a different choice or different compulsion to get involved than, say, Australia joining the US in the invasion of Iraq, which is also a war of choice. Now, both of them are war of choice, but there's a different...
But there's a different...
morality at play in my mind.
There's a different impulse. Well, I don't know. I mean, at this point, I will come clean. I was living in New York City on September the 11th. I smelled the dust. I heard the sirens. I didn't see the towers fall. I was living in Queens at the time. Shouldn't be a surprise I ended up where I did. But I think you have to remember back to those times on that one, and the general sense of offense against, and I don't know if we would call it an international morality, or certainly one, or sort of a sympathy between the Western philosophical nations. So that would include Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, etc., France, Europe. A general sense of offense that they felt at the attack on the Twin Towers, and sort of the things that came out following that.
The threat of WMDs,
yeah, the threat of well, yeah, and also sort of the general paranoia and upset that something so big could be taken down so quickly by a group so small. And so, those were strange times. I remember them. And I think in that case, where it was such a catastrophic damage to the West's self-image, that I think that most contributors to the operation in Afghanistan definitely thought that this was the right thing to do, if for no other reason but for the grace of God go we. And it was strange. Now, when we talk about, for example, the coalition of the willing in Iraq, I think we're on much firmer ground, because that one was odd from the beginning. There was no rational reason to do it. You hear Scott.
Well, there were interests. There were interests, certainly in Australia's case, right? Which to me is the rationale, which is it's almost colder and more clear than the emotional response.
But it's still not necessarily rational, because fundamentally Hussein was still back in his box. He didn't have a lot of manoeuvring room. There were no-fly zones about the north and south of the country. Sort of Iraqi Kurdistan was happily doing its thing. The only real problem with with Iraq at the time, I would suggest, is he was effectively unpunished. And the knots that the US and the British government tied themselves into to justify the use of force was really quite impressive. And, I recommend anyone read the reports that came out from the United Kingdom sort of after, and read between the lines of there. And you can sort of sense the sense of bafflement about it.
Like a Chilcot inquiry.
Chilcot, yeah.
Which was rather explicit in its summation that this was, almost fabricated, right? The reasons to going, and that it explicitly states that it was an illegal war.
Yeah, and what's interesting, I think it was the Chilcot inquiry, which is one that, and we've raised this before, Sir Lawrence Freedman sat on.
Right, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I think it was Chilcot he sat on, and so
that's interesting.
He was. I think Larry was on Chilcot, and I think so. This is sort of super interesting, because of course. To go back to this, wars of choice are messy, and you're never going to find a consistent rationale for them. You're never going to find. Now, Blair tried to put one down in Chicago with his famous Chicago speech, which basically said, if we don't like what you're doing inside your borders, we're going to fix it. Interestingly, that speech was basically written by Sir Lawrence Freedman.
The plot thickens.
The way I've heard the story told, I don't know if there's any truth on this, but Blair didn't have anything to say in Chicago. And so one of his aides phoned up Sir Lawrence and said, do you have anything on the boil? And allegedly, and this is probably apocryphal, Sir Lawrence sent over some notes on something he'd been working on, and basically Blair on the plane over sort of put ladies and gentlemen at the top and thank you very much on the bottom, and then read it.
I just read it. Oh
but
God! Well, I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah.
But he was, so Lawrence is interested in this too, and everything else, because it's quite a moral statement, isn't it? If we do not like that you are committing genocide inside your borders, we reserve the right to intervene. And that's great, because it is actually a very clean, very safe, or very unsafe for some, but it's a very clean, very direct statement of policy. The thing about the wars of choice and the way, for example, R2P has evolved, or more accurately died slightly, and everything else, is that what we have, you will never find consistent rationale for involvement in wars of choice. By people because sort of choosing to start one.
Because it feels like there's a perpetual clash between some idealized values that we try to project and live by, or set the standard for, and ultimately the interests that we end up pursuing.
It's that cold, hard reality that was sort of articulated, and again, a lot of your listenership is going to groan when I say this, but articulated by Thucydides. It's that, why do men go to war, asks Thucydides. Thucydides says, because of fear, honor, and interest. And honestly, actually, when you look at it, you pluck that out and you say, well, what are the, now a lot of people say, well, he's old hat and everything else. But the thing is, if you apply that test to wars of choice, then all of a sudden it gets super interesting, doesn't it? Because why do people start, why does the aggressor start a war of choice? Well, it may be because of an articulated fear, or it may be because of an articulated interest, or it may be because of articulated honor. And those are the three reasons. So why did Russia start a fight in Ukraine? Well, we might suggest because of certainly a publicly articulated fear, certainly a publicly articulated sense of honor that Ukraine had always been part of Russia, and certainly an articulated interest in preventing NATO from expanding into, for example, Ukraine, or the European Union expanding into Ukraine. So there, all of a sudden, we can sort of dig up a 4,000-year-old dead Greek and say, actually, he may be on the money on this one.
I couldn't agree more, which then again, as an aspiring military ethicist, I then come down to the question, what is the point of military ethics then, right? Because, are we just trying to soothe a wound that's, never to be patched up, right?
What is the point of... ouch. What is the point of military ethics? The point of military ethics is to make sure that you don't lose your soul in the process of achieving the policy.
Yeah, okay. That's a good one. And again, if we're looking at wars of choice, many would say, not even just me, but I'm certainly one amongst them, that we have perhaps lost our soul in Iraq and Afghanistan. Are we now morally bleeding because of those two wars and the things that we have participated in, that we have done as those who have deployed? And is our soul, as Western militaries, somehow wounded? And judging by the figures of moral injury, PTSD, suicides, etc. Now, I don't have hard evidence on this, but there's certainly anecdotal evidence, and certainly through a number of people that I've spoken with, that the way we fought those two wars, the reasons we fought those two wars, and the way we left those two wars has certainly contributed to moral injury of many of our troops.
I remember when the withdrawal happened, a friend of mine who is a Special Forces medic in the US Special Forces, he's now a recruiter, phoned me up when it broke, and I'm sat in my office, phone to my ear, and he's just like, what was the point? And there's certainly lots of people thinking that, and of course that that doesn't go to deny the people who came back actively harmed with injuries, psychological injuries, which run the gamut from post-traumatic stress right the way through to the very technical term that is moral injury. I think that those 20 years cost those that fought those 20 years much more than blood and treasure. Now, I'm not saying that they lost their souls, but I think they were so injured. And I think that is, it's not just the physical injuries that came back, but there's now generations of soldiers who have come back either injured through what they saw or injured by what they didn't see on the withdrawal. And that sense of, well, we went there, we died there, and what was the point? And I think that's a fair question. I don't think. Now, do I think militaries are themselves soul sick? No. I think that they're in fairly robust soul health. However, I think they have some very hard self-interrogation to do about whether they can keep that going. And I think that runs the gamut. And I think it's one of these things that the military is a great social experiment. In the United States, the military integrated before the rest of society. When you look at, for example, the Detroit riots, initially the governor tried to use National Guard troops to quell the Detroit riots. And these were all white farm boys from wider Michigan. And it was only when the airborne regular army were deployed did things calm down. And why did it calm down? Because the white soldiers in the in that regiment had been working alongside, friends with, and everything else with African American soldiers. And it's only so now there might be a case to make that when it comes to matters of, for example, integration, particularly of women into the force, mental health care, sexual assault, and other things, that the last 20 years have seen military so occupied by something else, i.e. fighting a war, that they haven't been able to quite keep pace with that, with sort of the trailblazing that they used to do when it came to attitudes inside society. And I do think that there are some sort of older attitudes that still unfortunately float around a little bit about, for example, place of, gender roles, about, for example, mental health and things like that. And because these armies have been so incredibly busy doing other things, that they haven't sort of been able to see, actually, we maybe, what we're thinking about now is we're having to play a little bit of catch up on this. And I think this is something that actually features into the thinking of, some of the very, very most interesting officers I've met are people who are interested in, okay, where do we go from here? And it's quite difficult in the current political environment here, because of course then they get branded being woke, whereas the British Army leaned in on it and did a poster recruiting campaign saying, "Oi, snowflakes, we need your empathy." And so it's watching these two sides of the Atlantic try to get to grips with how do we go forward. And it's the military is always going to be roughy-tufty, isn't it? It's always going to be fairly rough and tumble. There's always going to be areas in which sort of some people may react with distaste to attitudes held. But the thing is, I think that it's become sort of an imperative now to find a way of trying to mitigate some of that injury which has been caused previously in the last 20 years, and as a matter of prevention. And that's the interesting bit. The interesting bit now going forward is, okay, so we've taken this beating, we've taken this licking, we have had hundreds, thousands injured. Now, what do we do to prevent that injury going forward? And that's and that's going to be the interesting part. How do they develop in that way?
And ultimately to win wars as well.
And ultimately to go back to winning wars.
Yeah, which is obviously the reason I hope we'd want to go to a war, which perhaps is a neat pivot to your thesis and some of the thinking within it. Because I'm conscious that we've not necessarily derailed, but there's just so many interesting threads here that I've almost forgotten that there was an actual reason that we wanted to talk. and that is your actual thesis, which is and I must admit, and we jokingly said, I hope before we started recording. I certainly hope that that you turn this into a book, that this doesn't remain merely a thesis. That as we all know, is the kind of joke that the person, the spouse, their supervisor, and the examiner reads. Leaving it to at most half a dozen people. Because certainly I thoroughly enjoyed it, and there were so many threads in that thesis and so many resources that I've underlined for my own follow-up as well. But maybe you can just give us a quick kind of wave tops. What is the thesis about, and what's motivated it as well?
Right. So, you should always be able to answer a question in a sentence. The argument presented is that being good in the sense of morally positive is actually good strategy. That's it. So making the right decisions from a moral perspective that are morally defensible is actually entirely it leads to good strategic decision making. There are consequential adjustments needed to sort of ensure that, but that allows for a certain amount of flexibility, which actually further reinforces the idea that it's potentially good strategy. That's it. So that making the right decisions from a moral perspective, we could use the term moral perspective, is a defensible decision against morality, i.e. not putting babies on spikes, is actually a good idea to help us win the war. There you go.
Right. So perfect. Now the audience listening, two things might pop up in their mind. Firstly, how is that a surprise? As in the grand scheme of things, why should we be surprised at that, right? Because it sounds so reasonable, all right? And then secondly, the flow on from that is, obviously, if this is a thesis, a PhD thesis, then we obviously haven't been doing that. If you're proving that doing something like including ethics and ethical and morality in the conduct of war being good, obviously we haven't been doing it.
Well,
would those two be accurate?
Kind of. I mean, part of me was, when writing this, part of me was sort of going up against a lot of the literature. Okay. A lot of the literature wasn't particularly interested in being good. A lot of the literature was just interested in victory. And so...
Right. That's important. Yeah. That's an important point.
And so there's sort of some questions there about, and talking to some, not all practitioners, some had the view that sort of, you can go back to sort of a comment that you frequently heard about Afghanistan. How can we win with one hand tied behind our back? And what I want you to see, part of me wants to sort of argue on that and say that, okay, so you've got one hand tied behind your back, but what can you do? And if you have one hand tied behind your back, what do you need to be able to win? Do you need another bloke with his hand tied behind his back as well? Because then you've got two hands. That's the question. But
also there's sorry to jump in. There's also something there, the implied that there's a hand behind my back, meaning basically that I can't employ my force to its full potential.
Exactly.
That in itself is perhaps a problem. That rationale, right? That it should be so that me not using these techniques, processes, procedures, like for example torture, they shouldn't even enter my spectrum of things that I can do with both hands. Right?
I agree.
So therefore, I shouldn't have had any hands tied behind my back. I've got both hands. It's just that my two hands are capable only operating on this spectrum out of the available spectra that exist of human action.
I think what was interesting was the reception of courageous restraint. Now, I don't know if you know courageous restraint, generated by General McChrystal, where he basically said, don't do anything until you're absolutely sure, effectively. And even if you're shot at, try and restrain yourself as much as possible. And there was an interesting BBC documentary, which I forget the name of, which talked to soldiers about the policy of courageous restraint when it was sort of introduced into British forces. And sort of initially, there was quite some skepticism. And then they went back to the same soldiers, and the answer was, we couldn't do the job without it. Really? So what you're telling me is that by not functioning at your full capacity to deliver force, you're actually finding benefits, particularly in this war of choice environment. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. Why is that? What's going on there? Everything else. Now, there are, the Gallaghers of this world or anything else who, and those that supported the policy of torture in Abu Ghraib and everything else, say, no, we absolutely needed it. This is what we needed to do and everything else. I mean, John Yoo, the writer of the infamous torture memo, sort of doesn't seem to need convincing that torturing people is actually, quite handy. And fundamentally, I would disagree. And I certainly would disagree with people who try and defend that position, because, again, another idea that McChrystal developed, which is sort of super interesting. He sort of articulated it, although we kind of already knew it, which is this idea of insurgent math. And, his idea of insurgent math, you kill one innocent person, you just generated another 10 insurgents. So at which point then we have to say that there is actually an operational requirement to be restrained, because if I kill one innocent child and I generate 10 more insurgents, that's 10 more insurgents that I and other soldiers around me have to deal with at a later date. And all of a sudden then, what I'm doing is I'm just I've got a self-generating enemy there, which I don't particularly want to have if I'm looking to enforce something looking like a civil peace.
It's completely counterproductive.
Yeah. And the thing is that fighting without the restraint is counterproductive. Let's look again at Ukraine. So we have seen the horrifying aftermath of Russian occupation or attack on towns in Ukraine. Victims of rape, summary execution, etc., etc., etc. Now, what do we think that's going to do to the Ukrainian will to fight? It's going to harden it. And it's just going to make Russia's job harder. Not only has it hardened Ukraine's will to fight, but it's also increased other states, United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, to equip Ukraine because of the horrifying character of what Russia is doing inside the borders of Ukraine. And so what has Russia done? Okay, it might, and I use this word with no sense of approval, it might feel good to kill a Ukrainian. It might, in that moment, for, I don't know, I would use the term Private Snuffy if he was American, Private Snufsky, to kill a Ukrainian civilian in the middle of the street or shoot a Ukrainian dog. Okay? It might feel good. Yeah. That's me. I'm fighting. I'm leading the war. Yeah, congratulations, Private. Congratulations, Captain. You have now just generated another 10, 20, 30, 40 Ukrainian volunteers. And let's see how that's gone for Russia. We're in the second year of the conflict right now.
The 3-day invasion, the 3-day special operation.
The 3-day special operation. And it started in February last year. So it's now 16 months long. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, okay. So I want to get to the individual factors of the model that you discussed, because you've already alluded to a couple there. But just before we get to that, I think it's important to clarify what we mean, firstly, by ethics, morals, and morality, because those three terms are often used interchangeably. Yes, they are.
But of course, in your description, and I really liked it, and I thought it really answered the question in my mind, the distinction between those three. It might be worthwhile going through those. Okay,
so now, yes, they are usually used interchangeably. Now, I have to caveat any answer with the fact that I am not a philosopher. Okay. And anything that I have written is gleefully disavowed my philosophy, because this was me sort of partly pulling a semantic trick to try and get this, to try and clarify the argument, but also just to make it more understandable for people like me who aren't philosophers. So, right, morals. Morals is an internal condition. I have morals, you have morals. Everybody has some kind of moral code in their head, and it's been installed by different ways, usually by socialization, belief in God, religious observance, and all that other kind of fun stuff. And you have this code inside your head, and then we live inside a morality, and that morality is sort of the wider moral, so in a society, we can say a society has a certain morality. And that may change, or may be different. But broadly speaking, we all agree on the same things. Rape is bad, murder is bad, kittens are good, things like that. Okay. Ethics is sort of external to the individual, but internal to morality, in the sense that we have to make morally or just decisions that are justifiable against morality in an environment of competing demands, both moral and physical. So, for example, tuna fish sandwiches. Trust me, I'm going somewhere with this. Now, I don't eat tuna because I don't like it, but I could also make the decision about tuna fish sandwiches that I refuse to eat tuna on principle because tuna stocks are completely, are being depleted. So let's agree that I take the second position. I disagree with tuna fishing. Now, I have a tuna fish sandwich, which I refuse to eat. But someone who is starving hungry, I could give them that tuna fish sandwich and the hunger would be relieved. But the thing is that I am not morally, I'm opposed to giving them the tuna fish sandwich because I disapprove of fishing tuna. The wider morality says that I should probably give that person the tuna fish sandwich because they're starving hungry. Okay, right, fine, happy day.
So there's a clash between the morality and your own morals in this case.
And then I have to make the ethical decision. And what's the ethical decision? The ethical decision is that I should give them the tuna fish sandwich. However, it might not be. And this is where it gets really exciting. Because if that person, depending on how hungry that person is. Now, let's say I have a tuna fish sandwich and I have just walked into a concentration, and I have just relieved a concentration camp. Is it ethical for me to give the tuna fish sandwich to one of the victims of this concentration camp? And the answer is,
having read your thesis, I know the answer. So
and what is the answer?
Therefore it's not, because in this instance, that's right, because it will kill them. It will kill them because of that's right.
Because of the components in it. All right. Now the thing is, I'm also violently morally opposed to oatmeal. I think oatmeal is a terrible thing and shouldn't be given to anyone. Now, if I'm in the concentration camp environment, I am morally obligated to give the oatmeal to the concentration camp victim, because the oatmeal is probably something that they can digest and begin to gain strength from, even though I'm morally opposed to oatmeal, in the same way that Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes is morally opposed to oatmeal because it's horrible. But these are so the thing is that ethical decision making is dynamic. And so what we can't say is ethical in one decision is not necessarily ethical in another decision. It's entirely ethical for me to give, it's an ethical demand that I give someone who is simply hungry a tuna sandwich. That's fine. Even if I disapprove of tuna, I am ethically obligated to give the tuna sandwich. However, in the concentration camp, I am ethically obligated to not give them the tuna sandwich and to give them instead oatmeal. And so the problem with ethics is it's dynamic, in my view. Now, other people will disagree, and they're probably right. But ethics is a state of dynamic decision making based against internal value sets and wider prevailing morality to come to the right decision.
Right. Okay. I like that, because it makes it also very subjective, and how we interpret what is ethical, in other words, what is right and wrong, is hugely subjective. Which again makes the work of the military ethicist all the more hard. So, which is why I really liked then your model and the breakdown of your model, because the way I was reading, in fact, that's a question. Who did you ideally write your thesis for, and who do you think could most benefit from reading it?
So who did I write it for? I wrote. My target audience was my mother. If she could understand it, anyone could. The relative, the intelligence.
Has she read it?
Yes, she has. Number 5. But she is the relatively well-educated non-subject matter expert who has interest. Now, traditionally, a lot of theses are written to sound very intelligent and to please the academic audience. And I mean, I had to write it for a degree, right? I had to please the academic audience. That was not my target audience. My target audience is the interested non-subject matter expert who's interested in thinking about these things. So, for example, let's say the major, or the colonel, or the lieutenant colonel, or the captain, or the lieutenant, and possibly even, in fact, indeed, the non-commissioned officer. This is aimed at people who don't know bugger all about this, but they have an interest in it. And and I want to articulate across the reading spectrum as best I possibly can, so that it includes everybody in the discussion, and not just, for example, a bunch of military ethicists at a conference. I'm interested in actually addressing to the practitioner, the people who actually have had things thrown at them, which go bang, and possibly have suffered losses in combat and anything else like that, so that they can understand, so that they can approach and address these ideas in a way that's not too threatening, and doesn't use too many big words and anything else like that. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in my friend Sergeant Major, now Flight Sergeant Niokas. I'm interested in my friend Colonel Brunton. I'm interested in my friend Colonel Benest. I'm not necessarily interested in, Dr. such and such from Watson State University.
Perfect. And you'll be pleased to hear that it certainly resonated with me as a really interested observer, because and I'm also a very visual learner, so I really like the way you set out the model, and you help us throughout your thesis by updating the visual model that you present.
That's funny. I took such a pasting during my exam for that. It was called a distraction.
Okay, that's interesting. See, that again, that's perhaps where the divergence occurs, right? Of perhaps the practitioner versus the academic, because and this is not to say this is not an academic text. It is, right? But also there's humor, there's your own personality is deeply infused in it, and I've chuckled more than once, just because of the phrasing that you use and even the jokes that you use, which kind of takes it. And I'd imagine you probably would have been grilled for that a little bit as well, because it does it's a little bit personal. It's stamped with your personal character. It's not, a sterile document.
I got away with that, actually. And I think it's possibly by dint of reputation inside the institution and yuck from my external examiner, because his stuff was all like that too.
And I think it's great, which is why I say I hope this becomes a book, because it is not merely a thesis, or at least I've read a few, and this is one that I wanted to come back to, as opposed to one that I was I was forcing myself to read, right? So there is a difference, right? There is a difference, but I do want to come back to now this model. So perhaps can you lay out the key components of your model and how they interplay? Because as I said a couple of times now, it draws a very clear picture in my mind of the dynamics of war, that might help our listeners visualize what we're talking about.
Well, okay, so I describe it as effectively a football game. If you imagine a ball on the field and two competing teams trying to get the ball into two competing goals, okay? Now, all we have to do from that is imagine that now, anyone who's kicked a beach ball knows that they don't go where you want them to go, right? Whereas anyone who's kicked a football knows that they do go basically where you want them to go if you've got more skill than me. Now, the idea is that both sides of a conflict experience the one ball in a sort of with different weights, or different moral weights, different import, let's say. And that it's very easy to overkick a beach ball, but it's also very easy to underkick a football. And so you have to tune how much force you're going to kick the ball with according to the weight of the ball, right? So it's possible for it to get out of hand. So if I apply too much kick to a beach ball or something that has too little weight attached to it, it's going to get out of hand very quickly. If I apply too much kick, if I apply too little kick to the football, to the regular weight football as one side perceives it, then it's not going to go far enough. So I have to tune the amount of force I have onto the ball whose weight I'm sort of experiencing in a different way. There's a kind of duality of mass. And so so going back to your sense of war of choice, imagine that the ball is a war of choice and that the aggressor, because they've decided to start this war, they're the ones making the running. So they have, this ball has a mass of 100 and they're applying a force of 100 because that's their effort against the mass, right? Now, we might not have, because we're only fighting for shrimp, in our Thai example, we may have a very sort of light experience of what's expected, of what we expect a ball to be. And so if we overkick it, it's going to get out of hand. If we underkick it, then it's not going to go anywhere. So we have to try and balance somehow our sense of import of the war, or we have to artificially restrain ourselves in order to be able to apply more force in a controlled fashion so that we can control our beach ball. The idea is that if one team has a mass of 100 applied to a ball, we have to try and figure out how we experience the mass of the conflict 100, even if that means that we need to sort of reduce the amount of force that we use, but use it in a more diffuse way to be able to control the ball, control the conflict in the same way that the other side can control the conflict because they're applying 100% effort to 100% mass. Does that help?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it would also help to discuss the two examples, the two wars that you discuss in the thesis, the Falklands and Kosovo, to just contextualize the various forces at play or weight. I'm just worried that people will get a little bit confused with mass, weight, force, effort, etc. Right? Now, my mum's a physicist, right? So I've grown up with physics. So again, it spoke to me. But I just don't want to lose somebody.
I come from a fine tradition of robbing scientific terms. Okay, so let's look at the Falklands. So the Falklands is really interesting. So the Falklands, sort of the origin of the conflict fundamentally is that Galtieri needed a quick domestic win because the economy was going south, and because of the historic claim of Argentina against the Malvinas, the Falklands, he was able to send a fairly small military contingent, which was able to overcome the resident Marines in the Falklands and claim them for Argentina. Now, we have to say on this particular occasion, he didn't take it as serious. He didn't apply the 100, although he probably applied as much force as was necessary to achieve that outcome. The difficulty for him was that Margaret Thatcher was in power, and this was an affront to the British state. And all of a sudden, this became effectively, and again, I lived through this, an all-consuming effort to be able to retake the Falklands on behalf of the United Kingdom. So
there's that honour that we talked about.
There's that honour, yes, absolutely. But also, I mean, there was sniffs of interest in there too. So what's interesting about this is that the British, even though we might suggest that they were the attacked party, and so they were able to summon up as much force as they possibly could and head off to the Falklands in order to retake the Falklands at great cost. It cost lives, ships, money. Huge effort was made, and Galtieri was unable to respond to that because he had completely misunderstood both the import of the Falklands to Britain at the time and what it would take to keep the Falklands and to stop that conflict from spiraling out of control from him. Whereas, of course, the British were just like, gung-ho and off we go. And so what happened was that Argentina, one, failed to calculate how much force was going to be needed or to take the conflict as seriously as they should have taken it, and to summon up enough force to be able to repel the British sort of counter-operation. Whereas the British turned up, they turned oil tankers into aircraft carriers. They managed to fly Vulcan V bombers from Ascension all the way to the Falklands and eventually land them in Brazil. The British were able to basically expend any cost to be able to resolve the situation to their favor. And so what we have here is a misunderstanding of the mass that Britain would attach to regaining the Falklands. Galtieri thought he was just going to get them and walk away. And by misunderstanding that immediate application, of seriousness to the conflict and the immediate mobilization of equipment and troops and money and aeroplanes to be able to take that, that articulated quite how important, seriously Britain was taking it. He completely underestimated the import. He didn't really have a lot of commitment to it. This was an attempt to basically head off domestic disaster in the polls because his economy was crashing. Equally, he wasn't able to summon up enough force to be able to respond to what was coming down the Atlantic from the United Kingdom. And we look at that. So the General Belgrano, horrible incident. I would suggest that the biggest mistake in the General Belgrano issue was one putting it to sea in the first place. Because
just give us tell us about it.
So the General Belgrano was a Argentinian warship. It was actually bought from the Americans. It was Second World War stock, and it was in terrible condition. Didn't have, Argentina didn't have enough fuel to do, for example, regular training trips and that kind of stuff. And it was sent to sea, and it was sunk by a British submarine at the very edge of the sort of the zone of control that the British had declared. And it was an enormous controversy. Questions asked in the Houses of Parliament, lots of angry Argentinians, of course, lots of angry Brits about doing it and everything else. And
I don't understand why. Sorry, because it was outside of the.
It was allegedly out. It was sort of at the very edge of sort of where the British declared, fair game on everything, and also it appeared to be steaming away. So it represented no tangible threat. And despite that, so despite there appearing to be no tangible threat, the order was made to sink the Belgrano. And the Belgrano took, I think it was one, maybe two torpedoes, and sank immediately because it was in such terrible condition. The crew didn't stand a chance. Now, I would suggest that the biggest error in the Belgrano incident was putting the ship to sea in the first place. And you're going to get lots of angry emails about that. I'm sorry, but we can question the decisions made sort of in the run up to the shoot, to the shooting of the Belgrano and stuff like that. But as an expression of will, that doesn't come much stronger. And I think that broadly speaking, that what we can see here is that interplay of the experience of mass, the experience, how the forces needed to manage the mass and how we sort of experience the war is really well demonstrated when dealing with, for example, the Falklands. Now, you mentioned another conflict and I got so carried away.
It was Kosovo, because you talk about Kosovo in the book.
Kosovo's really, really interesting, because of course Kosovo is the first time that NATO did anything without international authorization via the United Nations. What was such an affront to the NATO powers, the sort of the ethnic cleansing and the refugee crisis and everything else, that NATO applied an enormous amount of, but it was mass, but it was still a war of choice. And so what they did was they managed how they applied that force in a fairly tricksy and interesting way. So, for example, quite a lot of air power was used, first over Kosovo and then expanded to wider strategic targets, including the Chinese embassy. Whoops, sorry. But ground forces weren't employed right at the very beginning. Now, this caused an immense amount of frustration for those who were on the borders of Kosovo prepared to go in. And, they wanted to go in and get the job done. But the thing was that the conflict had to be managed. Now, is it possible to say that the that the NATO command wasn't as fleet-footed when it came to making the decision to insert ground forces as it probably should have been? And I would agree on that. I think that they missed opportunities to bring the conflict to a successful close earlier, and eventually, instead they decided to wait. But what's interesting about it is that NATO was obviously looking at tempering the use of force against sort of what was tolerable to NATO societies. Remember, they also had to keep Greece on board, which is quite hard because Greece had traditionally been quite pro-Serb. And so by tempering the application, the points of application, the means of application, and the amount of application of force, they were able to sort of insert themselves into the conflict and certainly manipulate the conflict from the outside up to the point where they were interested, where they were capable of going in. Now, when the Allied troops arrived in Kosovo, they did arrive fairly heavily supplied. There was a fairly large contingent of resources, including American, British, and others, who arrived into Kosovo to sort of enforce peace. And it was a peace enforcement operation. It wasn't, now, in some cases, in a lot of cases, it was a peacemaking operation, followed by peace enforcement, followed by peacekeeping. But by going in with this clarity of idea of peace enforcement, they knew that they couldn't fight all out, that they had to restrain themselves enough to get the job done, but not more than to anger Serbia and, importantly, Russia any further than they already had. And what's really interesting about Kosovo is that this is the first time we really see these ideas being played with or being used to manage a conflict, to prevent it, sort of expanding, while still being able to get the job done, and manipulating things like rules of engagement and other things so that the goal can be achieved through absolute control rather than just taking a massive great kick at it and hoping it hits the goal. And I think that's really, really interesting from my perspective.
Absolutely, and especially the idea of control. I just want to get to that. But I just want to clarify the idea of mass, because there's or distinguish between mass and moral weight.
Yes,
because I think one strengthens the other. When we say mass, and I think you explained this in your writing, you don't mean the physical mass, the weight of the ships and the planes and the people, right?
So mass mass is a robbed term. Now, strategic theory uses mass, and mass is the concentration of force in time and space. Okay, strategic theory uses. Now, I use mass in terms of effectively moral importance. Okay,
yes. Yeah.
So a war that I start, I must assume that it's really morally important for me to fight it. Okay. Now, an intervening power may not have the same amount of moral importance attached to it. So let's say once, I've started this fight, the moral importance is 100 for me out of a scale of 100. Now, let's say you want to intervene, but it's on behalf of whoever it is I've declared war on, but it's not as morally important to you because it's not life and death, is it? Right? So it's only like a 70 to you. Now, which is
Iraq for Australia, right?
Iraq for Australia, 70, great, happy days. Now, if you pile in the sort of force that you need to address something that's sort of morally important at 100 to you, but it's only 70, you're going to wildly overkick the ball. And things are going to, it's going to go wrong. So what you have to do then is you have to try and figure out how you can apply 70. Enough for that 70. But maybe you want to go more than 70, but you know that you can't necessarily do, to try and kick 75 with a force of 70 is going to lose control. To try and kick 65...
If you'd like to hear the rest of this episode and gain access to all of the episodes of The Voices of War, simply become a subscriber using the link in the show notes. As you know, I will not feature any ads on the show, which is made possible solely through the support of our subscribers. If you find value in the content, you can become one now.